Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you like the video, make sure to subscribe my channel. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Old Friends. The crisp spring wind blew across the newly greening damp grass and through a sakura tree's blossoms, causing hundreds of delicate pink petals to fall gracefully upon the damp ground. It was very quiet and peaceful throughout Seoul society. The war with Aizen was long and hard, but it was finally over, and the Shinigami wanted nothing more than peace among themselves. The cool, gentle breeze still went on, whizzing past the wet silk kimonos hanging on a laundry line in the Kuchiki estate courtyard. The servants talked animatedly as they hung the newly washed clothes. The war was over, and it was celebrated all over the Seoul society, but of course, work around the house still had to be done. The head of the noble clan sipped his tea as he gazed out the window from inside the mansion. His raven hair flowing freely down his back without his Keynesian on his day off. He was not in his captain attire either, but wore a midnight blue kimono. And it oddly felt good, just as Rukia suggested, and as much as he hated that she was right, just to take things casual. He had trusted her enough, and told her of what he intended on doing today. After all, their relationship had become very close. At first Rukia was surprised, and she had doubted it, but Byakuya knew what he had to do. And so he had invited a very old friend over for tea to discuss the matter. He wondered on how he was going to tell her. Would she even remember the arrangement that would decide her and Byakuya's fate when they were only children? It was so long ago. Over 2 weeks ago, the elders of the Kuchiki clan had tried to make Byakuya reconsider on remarrying, so he could produce a successor of the family. Byakuya was astounded that they would even mention something like that to him, and so he refused. He hated the thought of betraying Hasana. How could he possibly replace his beloved wife? But the more Byakuya thought about it, the more he thought of how he failed to have children. And if he didn't have a family to carry out his clan's name, then it would surely fall. He knew there was no possible way that the elders would call Rukia one of their own again, especially when she was now dating Renji. And they would never accept their child if they were to have one. It was up to Byakuya to produce an heir. And so after a week of trying to get past the thought of marrying Hasana, Byakuya invited a woman over for tea. The woman he was once betrothed to long ago. There was a sudden knock on the door, interrupting his thoughts. Byakuya placed his tea down before saying, "Enter." The door slid open to reveal one of his servants bowing, and the attractive woman next to her with a smirk on her face as her eyes fixed on Byakuya. "Your requested visitor, Yoruichi-sama," the servant spoke. Byakuya then nodded, dismissing the servant, and she bowed before closing the door behind her, leaving Byakuya and his visitor alone. "Please, take a seat," he said, indicating to the cushion across from his seat. The woman grinned and she slowly walked over to him. Well, she said as she took seat. "I do believe that I haven't seen you since the war with Aizen. Although, we haven't been alone like this in a very long time, it's been a while, hasn't it, Byakuya-bo?" Byakuya's eyes traced over her. Her tall, but curved stature. Her smooth golden brown skin. Her long dark hair. He closed his eyes in irritation at the old name she had once called him. "Yoruichi-shihuan. Yes indeed, it has been a while." Yoruichi nodded and poured herself a cup of tea. She sat there happily as she drank, but she then noticed Byakuya across from her looking uneasy. Yoruichi frowned. This was probably the first calm meetings they had by themselves since before she left the Seoul society. "Hey," she said quietly. Byakuya's blue eyes, deep as a midnight sky, then met with Yoruichi's amber. "Is something bothering you, Byakuya?" He didn't answer. "Why did you ask me to come here?" Yoruichi went on. "I doubt it's because you heard I was here and called me to have tea and not say anything to me, right?" Byakuya gazed at her, his face emotionless as always. "No, I didn't," he replied. "I need to ask something important of you, Yoruichi," he said, his voice becoming more firm. "What's up?" Yoruichi asked, flipping her long ponytail behind her back. Byakuya sighed and started on what he had practiced to say for the past 3 days. "You are well aware that we are the two heads of the Kuchiki and Shihuan clans. 2 of the 4 noble clans of Seoul society. It is up to carry out our clan's names." Yoruichi said, nodding. "We're the heads of our clans and yet, We failed to have children of our own. What is to happen when we are gone? If our names are to fall, then what is to become? Yoruichi sat there taking in his words. First of all, and don't think we'll be dead for a while. I don't know about you, but I plan on living for at least another century. Second of all, that's all that's bothering you. Pardon, Byakuya said taken aback. You're afraid that we'll be the last of our clans. And it will be the last of our clan's names, right? That's exactly what I'm afraid of, Byakuya answered. Yoruichi's bottom lip then quivered, and she began to laugh. Byakuya stared at her, this time angry that she wasn't taking this seriously. Oh man, have you talked to Kuakaku about this too? Yoruichi said, wiping her eyes. I don't understand how you can find this a laughing matter, Yoruichi, Byakuya said slowly. Oh relax Byakuya-bo, Yoruichi said waving her hand. You have Rukia don't you? She's a Kuchiki, and from what I heard, Rukia and Renji is quite the item now. Yoruichi, you and I both know that the elders will not allow her to be head of this clan. Nor will they accept my lieutenant. Gah, who cares what the elders will or will not allow? You ignored their opinions a couple times now, haven't you? Byakuya blinked. I have, but I agree with this. Yoruichi rolled her eyes and sighed. She was getting bored of all this nobility talk. It always bored her, even when she was a child. Why does the Shihuan name concern you though? Yoruichi asked. Byakuya sighed. He knew this was when he would have to tell her. But the thought made him so uneasy. Our great families have a pact. My father and yours formed an alliance long ago. They did yes. So we have an alliance. It still shouldn't concern you if I have a kid or not. You don't remember, do you? Byakuya asked softly, why we first played tag together in the first place. Yoruichi crossed her arms and thought. She and Byakuya were so little then. Well, I just remember that our parents always set up play dates for us so we'd know each other better. That way when we were mar. She then stopped talking and her eyes bulged like a deer in a headlight. Married, she whispered. Yoruichi gawked at him. He couldn't possibly expect. So that's the pact you're talking about? She whispered. Byakuya nodded. The alliance they formed with a marriage of the eldest son and daughter of the two clans. He then grabbed a roll of old parchment from his sleeve, and set it upon the table. The document was still kept. The two sat there in silence. Byakuya's face still bland, Yoruichi's in complete shock. Her amber eyes then rested on the piece of parchment and she balled her hands into fists. Chapter 02, Proposal. Yoruichi bit down on her bottom lip. You, she said closing her eyes. You can't expect that everything would be okay with us as it once was. I can't even believe you'd ask something like this of me. You, bastard. Byakuya glared at her and set down his tea. I beg your pardon, after all these years, after you just think everything's okay with us as it once was. You're expecting me to go along with an alliance that was made over 200 years ago. Yoruichi then stood up. So you want children you say? Well you're not having sex with Mai to get them, Byakuya Kuchiki, so you just get that out of your mind right now. Yoruichi, Byakuya said, losing his patience. No, absolutely not. I'm not going to marry you, or become the mother of your children. And that's that. Oh really? Byakuya said raising his eyebrow, challenging her. Yes really, not even to bring back the honor of your family that you lost, once you hid yourself in the human world. Byakuya-bo, don't make me slap you, Yoruichi said dangerously. Byakuya looked away from her, and stared down at the table. I see, he said quietly. I showed this to the elders of the Shihuan clan, and they seem to agree on the idea of keeping the marriage blood pure. They like the idea of the marriage. Yoruichi stared at him, not believing what she was hearing. You talked to the elders of my clan. Before you told me. That's right, he answered. She could feel it. She really was about to explode. About to yank on his long locks of hair. Oh how badly she wanted to smack him. I walked away from nobility 100 years ago, and I could care less if I have a pure-blooded marriage. And you're not exactly one to talk, are you? That's enough, Byakuya said at once. Anger flowed faster and faster through his veins. How dare she even bring up Hasana? That is enough, he repeated. He then looked up at Yoruichi who was giving him a death glare. You, Yoruichi Shihuan, were never one to break a pact. A word of law. It's not my word of law, she corrected. But my father's. And seeing as he is no longer living. Then it would become your word of law, for you are now the head of the Shihuan clan. Byakuya retorted coldly. Yoruichi sucked her teeth. Why marry me anyway? She asked. Is it just so you can have an heir of full noble blood? I'm sorry, but I'm perfectly content with my life in the human world. I'm happy living at Kisuke's shop, and we keep each other a lot of company. I look out for Ichigo, and Orihime, Chad and Ishida, and I even give them advice. My life is their Byakuya bow. Byakuya said nothing, but continued to listen to her, so she went on. If I were to marry you, I would have to leave everything behind in order to be by your side. I do not want to give that up. Yoruichi then looked out the window, turning her back towards him, to view the gardens of the Kuchiki estate. There were so many old memories of that garden. It was where she and Byakuya would play when they were children, where they shared secrets, where they shared their first kiss. Anyway, this alliance you speak of is long dead, Yoruichi said, snapping back to reality. She didn't want to think about the past. But being here just brought back so many memories. You chose her, remember? In the end, you chose Hasana over me. And in the end, you decided to run off with Urahara without saying a word of goodbye to me. And that was before I married Hasana, Byakuya said. And when he spoke, Yoruichi could have sworn she heard the little tone of hurt in his voice. Byakuya then stood up, and stood behind her as she gazed out the window. His hands then rested on her dark bare shoulders. And though she wanted to push him away, angry with him that he would try to force a marriage upon her, she did not move. She could feel his hot breath linger on her neck and ear, sending shivers down her spine. It's been so long since the two were this close. She wanted to push him away, she did, but deep down inside her, she craved the old feeling of his touch. Yoruichi closed her eyes as his warm lips brushed past her ear. Why didn't you say goodbye, Yoruichi? Byakuya whispered softly as he caressed her shoulders. Why did you choose her? She whispered back. I loved her. Exactly. We were promised to each other, and yet, you chose her. Byakuya sighed and stopped rubbing her shoulders. And what of you? Do you love Urahara? Yoruichi opened her eyes and thought about that question. Did she love him? That was what she had to ask herself. He's my best friend, she said. We've known each other forever. He was there for me when I needed him, and I was there for him. We played together when we were children too. He's like my brother. I love him as my brother. And that is all there is. And me? Byakuya asked. Yoruichi sighed. We both know our feelings for each other have vanished. I do not love you anymore. If I did, I would have accepted your question immediately. Although the feel of you feels good, I do not love you. You don't love me either, obviously. Because if you had, you wouldn't only be concerned about only having a noble-blooded heir to this household. And the answer is still no, Byakuya Bo. So stop trying to seduce me into saying yes, Yoruichi said, finally pulling away from his grasp. Byakuya stared at her stunned. Seduce you, you think? Yes I do, Yoruichi nodded. The way you were massaging my shoulders, I'd have to say you were trying to seduce me. Byakuya pressed his palm to his head and sighed. This definitely wasn't going the way he planned. I wasn't seducing you, he said, after a very awkward silence. Good, but, oh here it comes, I just want you to consider my proposal. Become my wife, so our names won't vanish. Yoruichi sighed, and as she looked out the window again to see the large sakura tree's petals raining gracefully to the ground, she smirked. She then turned around to face him. You call that a proposal? Thanks for reading, guys. It's really appreciated. That chapter got a little hot, didn't it? And it leads to a flashback in the past in the next one. Thanks for reading, and please review. Layla. Chapter 03. A noble marriage arranged. Young and carefree Yoruichi Shihuan ran. The crisp autumn air blowing through her hair as the amazing sensation of Shunpo swept over her. She ran to one of the largest hills in Seraiti, as the view of all the buildings of the city quickly passed her by. She just felt so alive. She wanted to run faster. Faster until she collapsed to the maple leaf-covered ground in exhaustion. Faster. 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 Don't you ever get tired, Yoruichi? Yoruichi turned her head to see his barely visual structure as he also used shunpo. She smirked. Never. I could run forever, you know that. Are you giving up then? Yoruichi then stopped and Kazuki caught up with her. He was red in the face and his dirty blonde hair looked wild and wind-blown. Yeah, I bet you could, Yoruichi-chan. Kazuki then ran his hand through his shaggy blonde hair. How long do you think it will take our guards to figure out we ditched them? Yoruichi shrugged as a smile played on her lips. Not long, I suppose. But I don't care. I'd rather be here playing with you than sticking around with them. Yeah, me too, Kazuki agreed as he sat down on the ground. He was also part of a noble family, and he could relate to the annoyance of his own guards and servants. They would never leave him alone, let alone let him out of his sight. Especially when the four great families were in conflict with one another. As a matter of fact, him and Yoruichi weren't even supposed to be playing with each other anymore. I'm going to the Kuchiki house today, Kazuki-chan, Yoruichi said as she sat down next to him. Really? I thought all our parents were mad at each other. Yoruichi pondered for a moment. Yeah, I did too, but father says he wants to speak to Yoruichi-sama. I wonder why, Kazuki said as he picked at some of the browning leaves they were sitting on. Me too, but maybe I'll see Byakuya-bo. I haven't seen him in a while. Maybe I'll get him to play with me this time. Kazuki looked up at her. He never wanted to play with us before. Why should this time be any different? Byakuya's so boring, Yoruichi. Why do you want to play with him? Yoruichi then remembered all the times the four noble families used to throw occasional gatherings. Yoruichi and Kazuki would always ask Byakuya to play. Byakuya would always glare and reject them. Yoruichi then grinned. He's interesting. Kazuki looked at her like she was crazy. Byakuya Kuchiki. Interesting. He was one of the most boring kids he ever met. No, the most boring kid he ever met. How? He asked. Yoruichi tilted her head and thought. Well, he never smiles. It's weird, but maybe I'll get him to smile. Yeah, right. Kazuki scoffed. You think you can make him smile? By Byakuya Kuch. He then began to laugh, and Yoruichi's wide grin disappeared and was replaced with a frown. What? Maybe I really can make him smile. Yoruichi said, but Kazuki continued to roll around on the ground in laughter. Yoruichi cut her eyes and balled her hands into fists. Stop laughing at me. Kazuki still did. You want to bet on it then? She asked. Kazuki then stopped laughing, and wiped the tears from the corners of his eyes. It depends on how much you're willing to lose, Yoruichi-chan. Fine then. I'll give you all the candy my servants give me for a week if I can't make Byakuya-bo smile. How will I know you're not lying if you say he did? Kazuki questioned. Yoruichi put her hands on her hips. I'll ask my Nei-chan to watch us and see if I do. And when I meet you, Akiri will tell you to your face. Akiri is your little sister, she'll do anything you tell her to. Jeesh, do you trust me or not, Kazuki-chan? Yoruichi yelled. Kisuke's gray eyes widened, and his mouth sprung open. Of course I trust you, Yoruichi-chan. You're my best friend. Yoruichi raised her eyebrow and Kazuki growled. Fine then, I believe you. But I don't want candy if you make Byakuya-chan smile. What do you want then, Kazuki-chan? A favor. Fine, you can give me the candy then. I'll meet you here, same place, same time tomorrow then. Yep, okay then, sayonara, Kazuki-chan. And with that, Yoruichi got up from her feet, and vanished using shunpo. Urahara sighed and looked out from across the hill to view all of Seraiti. She was too confident for her own good. Later, at the Kuchiki household. A marriage, but Byakuya's only a boy, Takahiro. He's not to be married any time soon, Akemi. Do not worry, but in the future, he will have a fine and noble bride. Soon after they are old enough to join the Gote 13 as a captain or lieutenant. Akemi Kuchiki stared at her husband in disbelief. She couldn't believe it. Her son was to already be married off, when he looked no younger than 10 years old to the human world. Who is the bride? She asked. The eldest princess of the Shihuan clan, Takahiro replied coolly as he looked through a pile of paperwork. The Shihuan clan, Akemi said in surprise. But we are in conflict with them, are we not? It seems that in the midst of this war between the four houses, the Shiba and the Urahara clans have formed an alliance. They no longer wish to have conflict with one another, and they are thinking of asking the Shihuan clan to be a part of this alliance. If that was to happen, they would all be against us. The most powerful clan of the four. Akemi clutched her heart and took a seat in front of her husband's desk. They were planning on turning against them. But, which is why I asked the head of the Shihuan clan, Naoki, to visit today, along with his daughter. Hopefully we will be able to persuade his mind of not joining the Shibas and Uraharas. A marriage is the perfect way of keeping the peace. Takahiro then looked up at his wife, who still looked uneasy. Akemi didn't like it. She didn't like the thought of a girl already being arranged to Byakuya at his age. He wouldn't even love the girl. She looked out the window to see her only son training in the gardens with his sensei. He was young, but already his Reiatsu was impressive. She already knew he'd make a great Shinigami someday. Akemi then turned to look at her husband, whose long black hair was in his face as he looked over paperwork. "When will you tell him?" she asked softly. Takahiro sighed and put down his papers. "As soon as I am done looking through all this. But for now, I'm searching for the right words to tell him. But I know you'll understand this later on." Akemi pursed her lips together and looked away from him. "Oh, she'd understand all right." She then bowed to him before she headed to the door. Akemi had heard enough. "Of course I do. For I must, because you've already made up your mind," she said more icily than she had intended. "So I have," Takahiro replied in the same cold and hurtful tone. Byakuya Kuchiki sat in a seat across from his father, letting the news sink in. All he could do was stare at his father, who was looking at him, expecting Byakuya to reply at any second. But Byakuya couldn't even find it in himself to speak. He would have to marry that Shihuan girl, the one who would always ask to play with him, along with that Urahara kid. Byakuya could only remember a faint picture of her face since he hadn't seen her in a while, due to their parents' feud. But he did remember that she would act in a way that no noble should act when their families used to give occasional visits to one another's households. That girl was so strange. And he'd have to marry her in the future. "Do you have nothing to say, son?" Takahiro asked, raising an eyebrow. Byakuya went to open his mouth, but no words could find him. What could he say? "You've spent time with her before, correct? What do you think of her?" Byakuya knew his father was asking if he found her attractive. She wasn't really all that bad, but Byakuya didn't know if he could judge her. "She's..." He then felt his cheeks grow hot in embarrassment. "She is sort of pretty." Takahiro then smirked. "And she'll make a fine wife, in years to come, no doubt. Your mother seems to not like this arrangement." Byakuya said nothing, but listened to his father closely. At least his mother felt the same way he did. But what could he do? "You may not understand now, but it is only for the best. To bring peace within these clans, and also honor in keeping a noble-blooded marriage." Takahiro then looked up at Byakuya, who was trying so hard not to look upset as he balled his hands into fists. "You understand, Byakuya, don't you?" Byakuya looked down at his hands and took a deep breath. No, he really didn't. But as he sat there, he said something that he was always trained to say since the time he was able to speak. "It is my fate, and also my duty," he said slowly. "So therefore I will accept it." Meanwhile, at the Shihuan household. "You want me to marry Byakuya Kuchiki?" Naoki Shihuan watched his daughter fume around the room as the servants looked on in astonishment. Yoruichi didn't care if she was being unladylike, or unnoble-like, or even disrespectful for all that matter. The reason why her father was taking her to the Kuchiki house was so he could make arrangements for her to marry Byakuya Kuchiki. "Yoruichi," Naoki said, "I won't do it," she yelled, getting so frustrated that tears started to flow down her cheeks. "Not for all the candy in Seireti will I marry him. I won't." "That's quite enough of your yelling, Yoruichi. You're starting to startle our poor servants," Naoki said. His voice was very quiet, but it was also humorous and warm. Far from what she wanted to hear. Especially from him. Her watery eyes then met with her father's amber, which she had inherited. "Stop crying, little one. Wipe your eyes," he said softly. Yoruichi obeyed and quickly wiped her face free from tears, not wanting to allow herself to cry in front of Naoki. But she knew she wouldn't be able to hold in her emotions for long. It's an honor to you and this family to be married to the Kuchiki family, Yoruichi. An honor that you will be able to bring peace. But I don't want to marry that boy, Yoruichi cried. Daughter, I want to marry who I want. Naoki then closed his eyes as he started to lose patience. He was an easygoing, wise and kind man. And he always thought on what was best for his family. But there was no way getting through to that girl. Out of his two daughters, Akiri and Yoruichi, Yoruichi only listened to herself, and herself only. She was hard-headed, stubborn and, so much like himself when he was younger. Naoki then sighed and decided to start to reason with her. It's not as though I enjoy the fact of hurting you, or giving you away like this, he said truthfully. But just think that you could be a part of stopping conflict and hardship. Yoruichi looked away from him. He was now trying to act sweet and guilty, and Yoruichi knew that. Yes, but just think about it, Naoki said as gentle as he could. Biting her bottom lip back and thinking about it, ending the fighting did sound nice. But it still didn't change the fact that she'd have to marry Byakuya with no choice at all. And from what I've heard from Yoruichi-sama, his son is a very bright and powerful boy. Yoruichi snorted. Byakuya interested her, but all she could hear ringing through her ears were Urahara's words. Byakuya's so boring, Yoruichi. You'll be happy, daughter. The Kuchiki clan will treat you well. And this arrangement will take place in a few years' time. So you'll have plenty time to get to know him. Maybe you'll even grow to love him, Naoki said, throwing her a smile. Yoruichi instantly stuck out her tongue in disgust, and Naoki couldn't help but chuckle at his daughter's reaction. I felt the same way when I was told I would have to marry your mother, Naoki said. Yoruichi widened her eyes in surprise. What? Naoki folded his hands together and nodded. Your mother and I had never spoken about this to you or Akiri before, but your mother and I were also arranged to be married. Yoruichi gasped. That couldn't be true. Her parents seemed so loving to one another. And so kind, and also. But you seem so happy. Yoruichi said. How can you be happy? If you had an arranged marriage. Once we were married we came to tolerate each other. The next year, with only being with each other, we began to respect and enjoy our company. And then we became to love. And so here I am today, talking to my beloved eldest daughter. Yoruichi stared at her father flabbergasted, still trying to get past the fact that he and her mother had been arranged to be married. She would definitely have to ask her mother to tell their love story to her someday. Naoki then stood up and placed his large warm hand on top of Yoruichi's head, rustling through her long hair. I only ask of you to consider the idea of getting to know him. For I must make this alliance. But for now, just seem to mind him once we arrive at their estate, okay? Yoruichi shut her eyes at his warm touch and took a deep breath. Why was he acting so cool and easy about this? He didn't even get angry at her when she yelled at him. And he had even shared a personal story of how he and her mother came to be. Was this really happening to her right now? It had started out as a day looking forward to win a bet that she had set up with Kazuki. Now it was a day to dread the future and what was to come. She wondered how Byakuya took the news of their future wedding arrangements. She wondered what Byakuya was doing right now. And little did she know, a blue-eyed beau sitting in his father's office as he gazed out the window, was thinking the same about her. Well, I really do hope you enjoyed that chapter. I thought the two different ways of how Takahiro and Naoki told their children sort of fit into Byakuya and Yoruichi's own demeanor, I guess. Well, I hope you enjoyed the chapter and please do not hesitate to review or message me. A favor, is that all? And he thinks Byakuya Bo is boring. 160 years ago. Chapter 04. The Great Chase. 160 years ago. Byakuya stood in between his mother and father as the members of the Kuchiki clan waited at the front of their estate gate to greet Naoki Shihuin and his clan. Almost all the members of the house were there. Byakuya's parents, the elders, his father's most trusted advisors, and even his grandfather, the captain of the 6th Division and past head of the clan, made his arrival. Byakuya looked up at his beautiful mother, Akemi, as the long lacy sleeves of her expensive red kimono brushed past his small wrists, their hands grasped together. Byakuya noticed that his mother seemed bothered. He could tell from her gray-blue eyes that looked as dark and dreary as the sky on a stormy day. Even when she had managed to throw him a smile. He then looked up to gaze at his father, who stood next to him with his hands folded and his eyes focused on the outstretch of the stone path that led away from their estate. He wore a serious and concentrated expression as he waited for the Shihuan's soon arrival. He wondered on when they would get there. He then felt a sudden pang in his stomach as he thought of seeing Yoruichi Shihuan again. Though he didn't show it on the outside, he was actually nervous about seeing his future wife. And it didn't help the fact that Takahiro told Byakuya to present her with a gift. Though he knew it was his duty and his honor, he still couldn't get over the fact that he'd have to spend the rest of his life with that odd girl. Yoruichi walked behind her mother and father, scowling as her family slowly made their way to the Kuchiki household. Behind her, the elders and her father's advisors whispered small talk to each other about politics. Next to her, her little sister Akiri, who was a sickly child, hummed a little tune to herself as she stroked her long braid of hair. Yoruichi knew she was happy to get out of the barricaded manor, because she was always kept in her room for being sick. Akiri's happiness did nothing to help change her big sister's mood though, who was grumbling angrily to herself as they got closer and closer to the Kuchiki property. Naoki had told Yoruichi to think on marrying the young Kuchiki, but she had forgotten, until Akiri announced it happily to Yoruichi, that they would still be visiting the Kuchikis that day so Naoki could make the arrangement. After throwing yet another fit, Naoki's bodyguards of the secret mobile corps were forced to drag Yoruichi out the house, much to her mother Sayuri's dismay. Yoruichi then looked up at the secret mobile corps guards that walked next to her on both her sides, keeping close watch on her. She glared at them angrily and stuck her tongue out as they looked down at her. "Look, Nei-san, we're almost there, see," Akiri said excitedly pointing in front of them. Yoruichi stopped harassing the guards and looked ahead. Sure enough, she could see the figures of the Kuchiki clan at the gate of their manor, not far from where they stood. Yoruichi's throat went dry, and she held her hands tightly together. They were there. "Yoruichi," her mother Sayuri said almost immediately after Akiri spoke. Yoruichi groaned but looked up at her. "Yes, Okazen," she said, "come over here in the front, and stand with your father and I," she instructed. "The Kuchikis should get a good look at you." Yoruichi nodded, and leaving Akiri behind with their attendants, walked in between her mother and father. She spotted Byakuya, who was holding onto his mother's hand with an emotionless expression on his face, like always. Yoruichi bit down on her bottom lip as the Shihuans came to a stop as they were 5 feet away from the Kuchikis. Takahiro smirked, and he and the rest of his clan gave a low bow, which the Shihuans returned. Akemi closed her eyes, and turned her head away. "Old friend," Takahiro said stepping forward, "I am delighted that we will be able to put this awful feud to an end between us, Naoki-sama." "Certainly, certainly," Naoki agreed, flashing a warm smile. "It is an honor joining forces with you." Takahiro chuckled, and his gray eyes rested on Yoruichi, who was staring down at her feet. Well, is this the future bride of the Kuchiki clan?" he said. "Yes, Kuchiki-sama," she said bowing. Even though she acted wild and carefree, she was still raised in a noble family and was brought up on manners, and to act sweet in front of important people. "This is my eldest daughter Yoruichi. She is honored to wed your eldest child," said Naoki glancing down at his daughter, warning her not to disagree or act out. "As is my son," Takahiro said smirking. "Come forward, Byakuya." "Yes, Otosan," he said, letting go of Akemi's hand to stand next to his father. "Yoruichi," Naoki said, hinting for her to do the same. Yoruichi nodded and slowly walked in front of him. When they stood 3 feet away from each other, Yoruichi looked up to see the usual emotionless face of Byakuya Kuchiki. The two stared at each other, not knowing what to say as the adults gazed down at them, waiting for the two to exchange words. Byakuya then sighed, and reached into his pockets to reveal a beautiful jade-beaded necklace. "I have a gift for you," he said finally. Yoruichi's amber eyes widened and gasped loudly as soon as she heard the word, gift, and that it was for her. She gazed down at the necklace in Byakuya's palm, and her shyness instantly disappeared. "A gift? For me? Oh Byakuya-bo, I didn't know you were so sweet." Yoruichi squealed as she gave him a hug that almost knocked him over. Akemi's attendants awed, and Akairi giggled, though Byakuya and Yoruichi's parents, along with the elders, looked stunned. Byakuya stood there stiffly as Yoruichi snuggled into his chest. It was official. Life with that girl was going to be the death of him. "Thank you so much, Byakuya-bo," she said happily. "I can't breathe, Yoruichi-san." "Well," Naoki said, clapping his hands together. "I suppose there's no worries about them liking each other then. Now shall we sign this treaty, Takahiro-sama?" Takahiro looked back at Naoki, who was wearing his usual warm smile, and nodded. "Yes, certainly. Let's get to business over this matter." Byakuya watched Yoruichi as she sat next to him with her arms crossed. Naoki and Takahiro had traveled to Takahiro's office, along with their advisors, so they could make the deal in private. With the two heads gone, the families were left to their own devices in the Kuchiki manor. Akemi, since it was her job as hostess, went to show Sayuri around the estate, along with Akairi, who did not want to leave her mother's side. And so that left Yoruichi and Byakuya to stay with the elders in the tea room, and watch a heated discussion over politics. And like always, Yoruichi had found herself bored with Byakuya after she had made the greatest attempt to make him smile by picking out random elders to make fun of. "What about him, Byakuya-bo?" Yoruichi said, pointing at an elder who was falling asleep with a cup of tea in his hands. Yoruichi laughed, and Byakuya stared at her. "Why are you laughing, if he's an elder of your clan?" he asked, perplexed. Yoruichi suddenly frowned. "Well, you just have no sense of humor at all, do you?" Yoruichi thought. Just then she heard Kisuke's words ringing through her ears. "You make Byakuya Kuchiki smile. He's so boring, Yoruichi." Yoruichi then scowled and looked down at Byakuya. She couldn't let Kazuki win that bet. She wanted to prove that she could do it. Though Byakuya was a little younger than her, she was sure she could find something that could amuse him and herself. Anything to make the both of them laugh, and get their minds off their father's arrangements. Because laughing to Yoruichi made everything seem less broken. And then it hit her. "Byakuya," she said suddenly. "What's the matter, Yoruichi-san?" he said as politely as he could. Yoruichi smirked and got to her feet. She then tugged on his sleeve to stand up. "Why, Yoruichi-san, come with me, Byakuya-bo," she said, smirking as she dragged him along with her, her guards from the mobile corps dropping their tea and following behind the young nobles. Byakuya's face flushed a deep shade of red in frustration as Yoruichi dragging him through the shoji door. "What are you doing, Yoruichi-san?" Byakuya asked, struggling to get out her grip as they almost knocked into servants carrying a load full of laundry in their hands. Yoruichi rolled her eyes. "Just calm down," she said, opening another shoji door, which led to the Kuchiki large garden. But her plan was working. He was starting to get irritated. The perfect reason to chase her. Byakuya started to become impatient. It was bad enough he was going to marry this weird girl, but now she was dragging him around his own house. Maybe he would have to put her in check. "I, as your future husband Yoruichi Shihuin, I demand that you let go of me." Yoruichi turned her head and looked angrily at Byakuya. He demanded her, did he? "Fine then," she shot. She then let go of his sleeve, and Byakuya lost his balance, falling down hard on the damp browning grass. "Hime-sama," her two guards warned. But she merely smiled down at Byakuya with her arms crossed as he scowled up at her from the ground. "Yoruichi-san," he said in a slow, dangerous voice. "You will pay for that." "Oh really, Byakuya-bo?" she challenged. "You demanded me to let go. It's not my fault you don't have any balance." Byakuya cut his blue-gray eyes at her and got to his feet. "I beg your pardon." Yoruichi gave a mischievous smirk, and hit Byakuya lightly on the shoulder. "You can't get me," she said quickly to him before she disappeared using shunpo. Byakuya stared at where she once stood in total shock, processing what just happened in his mind. He then balled his hands into fist tightly. And just as Yoruichi disappeared, Byakuya was gone before Yoruichi's guard's eyes to set out after her. "Oji-sama, Hime-sama," the first guard shouted. He then rounded on the second. "Damn it, that girl is off again. And now the Kuchiki is gone. After them." Byakuya didn't know how Yoruichi had brought him to a point where he would want to follow her, let alone run around like a maniac. But he found himself becoming out of breath as he tried harder and harder to tag Yoruichi, which seemed downright impossible the more he ran. Yoruichi's guards cursed, and urged the two to come back, but they did not listen. Byakuya growled in annoyance as Yoruichi slipped his grip again. Every time he was inches away from her and close to touching her shoulder, she would then appear behind him and continue to laugh and tease him. "So slow, Byakuya-bo," she shouted over her shoulder as she ran over a bridge that crossed over a small pond in the garden. "We'll see about that," Byakuya shouted back. "Damn it, Hime-sama, come here," she heard one of her guards yell as they failed again to catch her. "You two are kinda slow too," she replied. She then looked over her shoulder where she saw Byakuya take off his haori, and throw it down on the ground, now starting to shunpo a little faster. He was getting serious on catching her now. But to her much disappointment, Byakuya wasn't smiling, or enjoying himself as they played tag. Yoruichi grinned and then stopped running as she hid behind a tree. She had yet another plan. "Over here, Byakuya-bo," she called, waving her hand. Byakuya's eyes widened. Why did she stop running? He then shrugged it off. Whatever it was, he had a chance of catching her now. He was now 7 feet away from her, standing next to the small tree, and he took a jump towards her. "Got you," he yelled victoriously. No you don't," Yoruichi said as she shunpoed behind him. And just as fast as Byakuya's chance of victory began, it ended as he fell on his face on the ground in the place where Yoruichi was just seconds ago. Yoruichi began laughing as she saw the sight of him with his face in the dirt. Byakuya slowly raised his head from the ground, his cute pale face now covered in dirt. He glared up at Yoruichi as she laughed. He now hated that girl. Well, looks like the Kuchiki prince is slow after all. "You loose, Byakuya-bo," she said happily. "Why you? Now you have to pay the price." "Price?" Yoruichi then bent down in front of Byakuya and started to tickle at his sides. If playing didn't make him smile, tickling definitely would. "Yoruichi-san." Byakuya panted as he bit down on his bottom lip, trying his hardest not to laugh. "Let go." "Sorry, Byakuya-bo," Yoruichi giggled as she continued to tickle him. "But I can't loose that bet." Let go," Byakuya said, swatting at her as she tickled under his arms. It was just too much. He was about to loose it. And just when Byakuya was about to let out the tiniest laugh, Yoruichi was suddenly swept up from off him. "Gotcha!" Yoruichi's first guard yelled jubilantly as he held Yoruichi under his arm. She gasped and looked up at the guard in amazement. "Oi, let me down," she yelled. "Sorry, Hime-sama, but your father told us not to let you out of our sight." Yoruichi frowned and started to kick at him, anger running through her veins. "I was in your sight, you big idiot. You. I was so close to making Byakuya-bo laugh, you big dummy." Yoruichi's second guard then helped Byakuya up, who was wiping the dirt from off his face as he scowled at Yoruichi. Such rash words for the princess of the Shihuan clan to speak. The second guard said as the first started to walk with Yoruichi back to the house. "But it doesn't matter what you say, you're staying under our watchful eye, whether you like it or not." "Bastard," Yoruichi whispered. "Byakuya, why on earth are you covered in dirt? And where is your haori?" Akemi stared down at her only son as she wiped at his still dirty face. Yoruichi's guards had brought her and Byakuya back to the tea room, after they managed to capture them. After 20 minutes, their parents had returned and found that Byakuya was still covered in dirt. Yoruichi and Byakuya looked up at the bodyguards, waiting for them to tell their parents of the wild chase they had in the Kuchiki garden. But neither one spoke. "We were practicing our shunpo, Akemi-sama," Yoruichi said slowly. "And Byakuya-chan fell. That is why he is dirty." Akemi looked back at Byakuya. "Are you hurt?" she asked immediately. "I'm fine, Okazen," Byakuya said in an annoyed tone. "I'm not weak." "Why, of course not. I was just." "Of course our son is not weak," Takahiro said as he looked down at Byakuya. "You were practicing your shunpo. Nice work, I am proud of you. And with your future wife at that." Byakuya nodded curtly and glanced at Yoruichi, whose smile fell as Takahiro said, "Future wife." "Yes," Naoki nodded. "Your arrangement is now set, daughter. You are to be Lady Kuchiki, of this household, once you and Byakuya are part of the Goei 13. Yoruichi gave a fake smile up at her father. Wonderful, she said. You see, Naoki said to Takahiro. She cannot wait, can't you, Yoruichi? And since Yoruichi and your son loved playing together so much, perhaps we shall arrange for them to have a meeting once a week. Don't you think so, Sayuri? Naoki looked at his wife, and her emerald green eyes fixed on her amber. Why, of course. That would be splendid, she said quietly. It would, Takahiro said, nodding in agreement. What say you, Byakuya? Would you like your fiancé to visit you once a week? Byakuya looked at Yoruichi, who was still wearing her fake grin. No, he would not want to see that girl any time soon, to be honest. But deep down inside him, he had the urge to ask for a rematch in tag. He had to beat her. His pride was just too big to let Yoruichi humiliate himself like that. Yes, Byakuya said quietly. Yoruichi looked at him puzzled, and Byakuya scowled at her. Well then, it's settled, Naoki. It seems we have another arrangement. So it does, Yoruichi father replied. But forgive me, Takahiro-sama, I believe it is time for our clan to take its leave, he said, looking up at the orangey-pink sunset. It is near dark. Of course, Takahiro said, bowing. It was a pleasure to have your family in our home, and to settle conflict with you, Naoki-sama. When our children are members of the Goei 13, a glorious wedding shall be arranged for them. Yoruichi looked down at her hands and said nothing. So it was arranged. She would have to marry against her will. Little Byakuya. And our families will cease to have strife between us. I thank you, Takahiro-sama. Naoki then bowed back, and the two clans exchanged polite farewells to each other before the Shihuans took their leave. Yoruichi looked behind her shoulder as they left to glance at Byakuya, who still seemed to be giving her a mean look. She then frowned and stared down at the ground. That boy really didn't smile, and it interested her to know why. Yoruichi then slapped her hand to her forehead as she realized something terrible. She lost her bet with Kazuki.